Wisconsin Eye's 2014 election coverage is brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice for Wisconsin hospitals, supporting high-quality, high-value care in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye coverage of the 2014 election continues. We're interviewing Susan Happ. She's a district attorney in Jefferson County. She's a Democratic candidate for Attorney General. Susan, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Thanks for having me.
In a programming note, Wisconsin Eye appreciates the support of the Wisconsin Hospital Association, which represents more than 139 hospitals and health systems, for making these candidate interviews possible. I want to go right back into something you said at the Democratic State Convention. Let's start there. Quote, "When will the attacks stop? As your next Attorney General, they stop with me." Close quote. Since the Attorney General does not make or enact laws, how can you make these attacks stop? Can you put that remark in context?
Sure. So I was referring to the attacks that we've seen on our rights recently. We've seen the implementation on the ban against same-sex marriage. We've seen our voter ID law. We've seen restrictions on physicians in terms of providing health care services and abortions as far as the admitting privileges. We've just seen a number of attacks, and we've certainly seen a war on women. And so, as Attorney General, certainly charged with defending our Constitution when we're talking about attacks on constitutional rights, that's something that I take very seriously, and as Attorney General, I think should stop.
If those laws are passed by both houses of the legislature, signed by the governor, how can you make them stop?
Well, let's look at voter ID. Let's look at the ban against same-sex marriage. They still have to pass constitutional muster. And so a great example would be our ban against same-sex marriage. That was a ban that was approved by the majority of the voters in terms of the amendment to our state constitution. Mm-hmm. But we still have to comply with the United States Constitution. The Equal Protection Clause says that we don't treat people differently based on their sex, age, race, or creed, and we also don't treat them differently based on sexual orientation. And so the judge in that case noted that there is a fundamental liberty interest in being able to marry who you love, and that the Equal Protection Clause was violated. And so it's not about approval of lifestyle, it's not about religious beliefs, it's about complying and comporting to the United States Constitution. And so as Attorney General, much like as District Attorney, I have an obligation to enforce laws, but I also cannot defend a law that I know to be unconstitutional.
And you're aware the Court of Appeals just ruled today holding that the ban on same-sex marriages enacted in Wisconsin and Indiana unconstitutional.
I just heard that on the way over here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a debate, same-sex marriage, that occurred about 10 years ago. So had you been Attorney General then, would you have issued opinions saying, I think this violates the U.S. Constitution? How high profile would you have been in the debate, albeit 10 years ago?
Well, I think it's an important, even though it's not a defined duty per se of the Attorney General, I think it's really important to provide guidance and assistance and input when you're talking about laws of this nature, particularly because now we've seen, the law was enacted, we've seen the litigation, we've seen the resources and the funds that have gone into litigating, this law, and it's not a good use of resources. And so to the extent as Attorney General that I can talk to legislators about proposals, or could talk to the governor, or could talk to other people who have input on an issue like that, and perhaps nip it in the bud in the front, I think that's really important. And I think I've done it as district attorney. I've done it when I was in private practice. When I see that there is a flaw in the system, or I see that there's a gap in a law, or that it's having unintended consequences, I'm always going to reach out to a legislator or to people who can actually influence the outcome of those types of issues, because I think it makes good sense.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that this is one of the issues between you and District Attorney Schimmel, your opponent on November 4. He believes that something legally enacted by the legislature and signed into law by the governor, there is a constitutional assumption. You seem to be saying something different. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Even if there's a constitutional assumption, you start with that assumption, that presumption, but then you have to determine whether there is actually a good faith basis to defend something. And like I said, the same-sex marriage ban plan is one that I stand on. And I think Attorney General Van Hollen all but conceded that it was a challenge that was likely to fail on his end in terms of defending it. And so I just don't think that's a good use of resources. And I'll give a great example. As district attorney, we have referrals on cases, and we're charged with, determining whether and what to charge on a case. If I have an officer who goes into someone's home with a search warrant, and they're looking for specified evidence, and then they come out of that house with different evidence, I have a problem, because constitutionally I know that the search of that residence wasn't a good search. I can't bring a charge for the evidence that was obtained in violation of the Constitution. And so you're constantly weighing those competing interests and making sure that actions and laws are in fact constitutional.
Let's use one more example. Let's use the photo ID.
Sure.
Passed by the legislature, signed by the governor. Had you been Attorney General, would you have said, I believe this violates our constitutional rights, therefore I cannot in good conscience defend it?
I would have, because we are the only state that now creates this additional element of a governmental issued ID. And our state constitution is very clear about the requirements that our voters need to have in order to be able to exercise that constitutional right to vote. And there are three. A governmental issued ID is not among those three. And so to the extent that we're creating an additional requirement to exercise that very important constitutional right, I think we've got a problem.
So in that case, the governor then would have probably said, thank you, I respect your opinion, Attorney General. We're going to hire outside counsel, correct?
Yep.
So my question is, would that have cost taxpayers a lot more to have that litigated?
It could have, but look at the money and the resources we've already spent litigating that. And look, that law was really a solution in search of a problem, right? It was presented to the legislature as a means to prevent voter impersonation fraud. And yet, when we got to the end of the day, the Republicans were hard-pressed to show a single case of voter identification fraud. And so I think that's where the vast majority of citizens and voters are tired of the partisan politics. We want everyone who's legally able to vote to be able to do so if they want to do that. And that's what this is really about. And it's about giving people the constitutional protections to be able to exercise that important right.
And one final example, the law that said a abortion provider must have admitting privileges at a regional hospital, you would have also said, I believe that violates the Constitution, therefore I'm not going to defend it.
I do, and that's still being litigated, but when you look at that piece of legislation, they've given no reason as to why they have singled out a single medical procedure. And it comes down again to people trying to restrict access to abortions. And so I think that as well is problematic. And look, these are all very hot button issues,
yes,
right? When you look at people's different perspectives and opinions, you've got to focus again on the Constitution. And I think if you go back to the Constitution on a lot of these challenges, that's where I have a problem as an Attorney General candidate in saying that I would defend those laws because they don't pass constitutional muster.
Another quote from your Democratic Party convention. You said, I'm the only candidate who can appeal to swing voters. How in this very polarized environment?
Just continuing the conversation that I've been continuing. You know, we emerged through the primary having won every single county. And the big part of my messaging from the very beginning has been, you know, I'm a Democrat in a Republican county, that public safety, that issues of our rights and our values aren't partisan issues, that we as Wisconsin citizens agree on those issues. And I think voters are looking forward to candidates and an Attorney General who's going to bring the voters back together again. And so by keeping the partisan politics out of the discussions and reducing the rhetoric, I think, you know, I've been able to, you know, just have a really positive message that does appeal not just to my Democratic base, but to those independent and swing voters and even Republicans. I can't win in my county, you know, to become the first Democratic district attorney in 7 years by simply appealing to my Democratic base. I had to talk to people about issues that mattered to them and about my willingness to keep politics out of that office. And had I not done that, I probably would have been out of a job in 2012. And yet I was reelected without an opponent. And so I think the voters are just ready for a change. They're tired of the gridlock. They're tired of the divisiveness. They want to see their elected officials working together and getting the job done, because that's what they're elected to do, and that's what they're paid for. And
Is there a check and balance argument to be made? Is it good for public policy, conceivably, if the governor is a member of one party and the attorney general, the state's top lawyer, is a member of the other? I covered my history. I covered Tommy Thompson and Jim Doyle.
Sure. You know, look, if Governor Walker is reelected, I mean, certainly in terms of our perspectives, there's going to be differences. But at the end of the day, whether it's Governor Walker or Governor Burke, I'm going to work with that governor. I'm going to talk to that governor about the issues that matter. I'm going to be talking about, you know, things that are of concern to our constituents. And I think we can really accomplish a lot if we pull away the partisanship. I mean, will there be issues that are going to be more difficult with the Republican governor office? Sure. But again, I go back to Jefferson County. You know, I work with my Republican elected officials to focus on the issues that are important to my constituents, that are important to me, you know, as a district attorney, and it's something that I'm going to do as Attorney General.
Do you run with Mary Burke? I mean, do you consider yourself not part of the same ticket, obviously, but right. Does she have the same goals in terms of change in the Capitol?
I think she does. I mean, we've gone around the campaign trail. We talk about a lot of the same issues. I mean, she's certainly focused very heavily on job creation, on you know, creating jobs here in Wisconsin. But when we talk about the core issues, which is getting Wisconsin back on track, getting rid of the divisiveness, getting rid of the politics, working together, those are very common themes that she and I are both talking about. And look, I'm just really excited for the potential of having two women in these very important positions, not because we're women, but because we're qualified women and because we bring unique perspectives, you know, to those offices, and you know, we can make history. So I'm very excited about the potential. Do you need Mary Burke to win your own race, Susan? I think she can certainly be of benefit to me, and I think I can be of benefit to her. But I think in terms of my credentials, you know, my experience as a frontline prosecutor, coming from that Republican county, being able to earn votes from people on both sides of the aisle, I feel confident in my ability to stand on my own. But I'm very pleased to have her at the top of the ticket. Yesterday, I interviewed the Libertarian candidate for Attorney General, and he's uncomfortable with the term top cop. You're comfortable with it, but what does it mean? You know, the Attorney General is the top cop in the sense that the Attorney General certainly is charged with enforcing, you know, the criminal laws, and there's certainly a lot of what goes on in the Department of Justice relates to public safety, whether it's internet crimes or, you know, sex predator commitments, or the assistance that the Department of Justice provides to district attorneys and law enforcement, whether that's training or supportive services, advice, special prosecutions, etc. But there's a whole other half of the Department of Justice that isn't related to the criminal law. You know, you've got consumer protection and antitrust. You've got the environmental protection unit. So I think a lot of voters, you know, think of the Attorney General as a top cop, and there is that aspect. But I think that another very important aspect is handling those other types of issues and being an advocate, being the people's lawyer, making sure that you are a voice of the people, and that includes representing not the special interests, but the average person, the person who wants to have a voice in their government, make sure that their concerns are addressed, make sure that, you know, their communities are safe and their kids are safe. And so I think there's another very important aspect of the Department of Justice that isn't just about the criminal law. Wearing a top cop hat, let me ask you about this. You say you're a founding member of the heroin task force. Next step to fight this growing problem, which exists in all parts of Wisconsin, tragically. There will be many steps, but I think there's a couple of things that as district attorney I've done. Certainly a founding member of the Jefferson County Heroin Task Force, which seeks to bring together people from very important groups, from not just within law enforcement, whether that's your human services, you know, your pain clinic prescribers, people within the community, your school liaisons, your drug task force, and people who have been touched, you know, by people who are either opiate addicted or maybe people who've lost a loved one to opiate addiction. And so bringing all those key players to the table and having discussions that help educate the public is really important. And so Jefferson County, for example, we're a smaller community, and smaller communities oftentimes may not have the resources or the experience to address things like the heroin epidemic. And so the Department of Justice has a wonderful role in providing education and supportive services to law enforcement and to district attorneys to help educate the public, because we know people are more likely to process information if we provide it to them, as opposed to just giving information for them to come and get. And so I think it's very important to have summits and to increase awareness. But on the flip side, when we talk about prosecutions, I've aggressively prosecuted the heroin dealers who put the lives of other people at risk. Most of those cases are prison cases because they're dealing poison that literally is like handing someone a loaded revolver. On the other hand, you have people who are heroin addicted or opiate addicted. You want to treat them in the community, put them on probation and supervise them and try to give them the tools to be productive members of society and to beat their addiction. So it's a really big job. It's a huge epidemic. It's touching everyone throughout the state, and we just know that we've got to do more. And ultimately, it may come down to having more resources and funding and grants and diversion programs to try to deal with this incredibly pervasive epidemic.
Well, we're talking about illegal drugs. Your position on both medical marijuana and the examples playing out in Colorado and Washington legalize the recreational use of marijuana.
Well, in terms of the medicinal marijuana and in terms of whether it's legalized, I think the key is regulation and supervision, because there's always the potential for abuse. And the jury's still out to see what's going to happen in Colorado. And my personal beliefs really are relevant in terms of a district attorney or as attorney general, because I enforce the laws. But I will say, having had a father who went through this horrible, painful battle with cancer, I would have done anything for him, to have some pain relief, and he was taking morphine on a level that was just astronomical and still no pain relief. And so for people who have a true medical need, and we know there are therapeutic benefits, I think that would be wonderful for people in that position. But you've always got to be careful about the potential for abuse to make sure that the people who are being prescribed the medication are the ones who are actually taking it.
The U.S. Attorney General, growing out of Ferguson, is worried about the militarization of local police departments, many of whom now have mine-resistant vehicles and grenade launchers. Are you worried about that?
Well, I look at law enforcement, they're here to protect and serve, right? And so we've got to always keep that in mind. But when our law enforcement, when our local departments start looking, more like armed military, I think it's pretty shocking, for people in general who aren't involved in law enforcement to see that. And Ferguson, I think, was an unfortunate example of that. And I think what that did for such a already contentious situation is it elevated it. It made the tensions between citizens and law enforcement even more heightened. Look, many agencies, and I don't think citizens are generally aware of this, even smaller departments, have SWAT teams. They've got SWAT buses, and if you get, armed officers coming off of a SWAT vehicle in a hostage situation, that's a little bit unsettling, but it's necessary sometimes to diffuse the situation. I think the disadvantage in Ferguson was that armed presence and that heavy militarization really increased the tensions. And so I think you've got to get, in those types of situations, you've got to have people at the table to sort of step back and say, okay, hold on, this is not making things better, it's making things worse.
Any other observations you took away from the tragedy in Ferguson in terms of if you're elected Attorney General?
Well, in terms of, I'm not so sure in terms of Attorney General, but I think as someone in law enforcement, we learn from it, right? It's easy to be critical in hindsight, but I think you have to look at that and say, there are definite improvements that we've got to make, because you have, not just the tension between the protesters who were there and law enforcement, but now you've got, this racial tension, which has been pervasive, not just in Ferguson, but throughout the states now, where people feel like that there is these racial disparities that are going on in terms of use of force, in the African working communities in general. And so I think, again, when you have issues like that, the first thing you do is you start talking about them, you acknowledge that they exist, and you bring people to the table and you say, how can we do better?
A follow-up on the racial question. Wisconsin leads the nation in the incarceration of African Americans. Do you see dealing with that issue as part of the job description of Attorney General?
I don't think it's part of the job description, but I think it is something that I feel an obligation to start talking about. We don't want to be the state that has the highest number of minorities incarcerated. We don't want to be the state that looks like it's warehousing nonviolent offenders. A lot of this stems from, federal issues, but again, anytime you have these inequalities, recognized, admitted inequalities, you have to start talking about them. And much like the heroin epidemic, you start bringing the key players to the table to talk about why it's happening. You bring in the legislators to say, for example, in the federal system, the disparate treatment between offenders was largely a part in the drug world between the differentiation in crack cocaine and powder cocaine. But then you got to take it head on and bring people in to talk about why it's happening. Law enforcement and prosecutors have a lot of discretion. So when officers are on a scene, they can decide whether to arrest. They can decide whether to cite. They can decide whether they actually refer felony charges to a district attorney's office or criminal charges. Then once our office gets it, we have a tremendous amount of discretion in terms of what we issue, whether someone's appropriate for a diversion program. And so I think there's a lot of discretion, that people in law enforcement have, but I think there are also a lot of players who we can bring to the table to start having good discussions about not just why people are coming to the criminal justice system, but why crimes are being committed. Is it educational? Is it societal? Are there young people who are basically being parents because their parents themselves are out of home or in jail? Or are there educational impediments to employment? If a person can't read or they haven't graduated from high school, how do they fill out a job application? And so you got to get, people within these communities who are seeing firsthand these problems also involved in the discussions, and then obviously recognize that this is a real problem. We've got to increase our diversion programs. We've got to not be incarcerating our nonviolent offenders, in prison, especially if they're youthful offenders and if they're not these serial offenders.
The law that says the Attorney General needs specific approval from the governor in one house of the ledge to pursue certain legal actions. Do you think that would hinder you as Attorney General?
In certain situations, perhaps, but there are, the statutory authority and powers that the Attorney General has are vast. There certainly are also federal statutes, 24 of them, I believe, that give authority for the Attorney General to act in other matters. So I think there's some possibility for there to be an inability to act in certain cases, but I think it's going to be rare. And I would hope that if cases come up where, I need to seek the governor's approval to pursue a course of action, that I would, again, sit down and have conversation about why it was necessary and that I could get that approval. One
of the biggest additions to the Department of Justice in the last few years has been administering the concealed carry permits. Attorney General Van Hollen wanted at one point to stiffen the training programs. Do you think we have strong enough training programs for those who apply for CCW permits?
I think there are definite improvements that could be made. The CCW class itself is only about 3-4 hours in duration. The people who take the class don't even have to have a shooting component of the class, so they don't even have to establish that they can safely load the weapon, operate the weapon, and discharge it, and then, of course, safely store it. That seems to be common sense to me. In terms of the law, I would like to be able to see that our law enforcement who are going to be coming into contact, for example, with motorists who might have a CCW permit, be able to know that if a person's pulled over, does that registered owner in fact have a CCW permit? And that's just going to be not just for the officer's safety, but for the driver and maybe the occupant's safety, just to say, I understand that you have a CCW permit. Are you carrying now? For everybody's safety, we just want people to be safe, and I think to the extent that we can look at bolstering our our current CCW permit process, we should do that, because we really want, it's not about impinging on anyone's constitutional right to bear arms or impinging on people to safely, legally have access to weapons. It's just about public safety ultimately.
Do you support universal background checks for gun sales?
I do.
You do?
I do. I mean, I look at common sense measures that can make us all safer. We're not talking about keeping guns out of the hands of law-abiding people. Background checks are designed to keep guns out of the hands of felons, out of people subject to domestic abuse or protection orders, and out of the mentally ill. And so I don't view that as a partisan issue. I grew up hunting with my dad. I'm comfortable around guns. I think people know that I have a carry conceal permit. I'm a member of law enforcement. So I feel very comfortable about guns. But I want people who have them to be safe, and I want the people who do have them to lawfully be able to own or possess a weapon. And if we look at the Brady bill, that's prevented something like 2 million illegal gun sales. That's what it's about, is that we don't want to put unfair restrictions on law-abiding citizens, but we want to make sure that guns aren't getting into the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
3 or 4 times that Wisconsin I has interviewed Milwaukee's police chief Flynn, he's talked about the need for tougher laws for criminals with weapons. Have you talked to the chief about this? Do you know what laws he's referring to, changes he's seeking, and could you support them?
I haven't talked to Chief Flynn directly about it, but I'm cognizant of the issue, and I think he's understandably concerned and frustrated with people who carry conceal in a criminal way or commit offenses involving weapons, and it feels like maybe there's a slap on the wrist, or that the penalties or the response isn't hard enough. And so we try in the criminal justice system to have people learn from their mistakes, to correct the behavior. But if you get a person who's committed an offense with a weapon, or they've been convicted of a carry conceal weapon charge, and then they keep doing it, then maybe we need to be looking at stiffening those penalties. I don't know if it might rise to the level of making it a felony. It might rise to the level of requiring mandatory jail. But the reality is, about every day we open up the newspaper and there's some sort of school shooting, some sort of other type of crime, whether it's a drive-by or some sort of interaction on the highway with road rage, where there are guns proliferating and people are dying. And so I think the ultimate goal that Chief Flynn's talking about is, how do we stop this gun violence? And we just need to do more, and it might require a legislative response.
Which one of those examples tragically was Sierra Guyton, 12 years old, gunned down in a school ground in Milwaukee. When you read that, your response was pretty much just as you've been saying?
Yeah, I mean,
tragedy as a mother. You have a daughter named
absolutely.
Haley.
I have a 13-year-old. She was 12 at the time when that happened. And we don't want our kids and our citizens to be victims of senseless gun violence. And so anything that we can do to reduce the number of those instances, we ought to be doing. Again, it's not the law-abiding citizens, it's not the hunters, it's not the people who are responsibly handling weapons who are responsible for those types of offenses. It's generally the people who are already violating the laws. And so we just have to do more to crack down. We can't have more tragedies like that. And we as a society, I think, have an obligation to say enough is enough.
It was an issue in the primary. Give us the short version of your position on first offense OWI and whether it's a crime.
Sure. So we talked about it in the primary, and we'll talk about it again, I'm sure. My position has been that I don't know that that's the solution, because you have someone who is impaired. They're not thinking clearly. They already know in the back of their mind that they could kill themselves. They could kill their passenger, they could kill another motorist and spend a decade or more in prison. I still get behind the wheel. And so I haven't seen the data to show that that is an actual deterrent. We also haven't defined by what we mean criminalize. Is it going to make someone spend 2 days in jail? Is it just going to make them a criminal? And this, of course, at a time that we're talking about the fact that our jails and prisons are overflowing. What I have said is there's no doubt in my mind that when you start talking about these repeat offenders who haven't learned from their touch with the justice system, they haven't corrected the behavior, we've got to get tougher. People who can spend as little as 60 days on a fourth offense drunk driving, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I think we all agree that's woefully inadequate. So we've got to get tougher on these repeat drunk drivers, and we need to do more in terms of our societal acceptance of drunk driving, in terms of talking to our kids about the dangers of drinking and driving. I presented it at my local high school, Jefferson High School, the week before prom this year, and I talked to those kids about the dangers of drinking and driving. And I started always by saying, you can't drink. It's not legal for you to drink, but if you do, you may never, ever get behind the wheel. And I think we as parents and as elected officials ought to be doing more to educate our kids and to start working on the societal acceptance of drinking and driving so that we can reduce the number of people who are going to get behind the wheel.
Both you and District Attorney Schimmel make hundreds of calls every year in terms of what to prosecute. One case conservatives have said involving the former Democratic spokesman Graham Zielinski, they have questioned why first offense OWI was filed against Graham. I don't want to get into a lot of it. Can you summarize?
Sure. So he was originally charged by an attorney in our office with a third offense, drunk driving. And in terms of the driving record that we could see in Wisconsin, it was a third. Unfortunately, as the prosecution went on, the attorney could not find the middle conviction. It was an out-of-state conviction from the early 90s. And so statutorily, it's our requirement to provide evidence of that conviction. It didn't exist on that out-of-state driving record, and we could not find any evidence in that state of that conviction ever having occurred. So it was fatal on that level. It was also fatal in terms of being able to establish that he had entered what we call a knowing, voluntary, and intelligent plea. And so constitutionally, we could not count that middle conviction because he did not have an attorney. He was not advised of his right to an attorney or what the state would even have to prove. And Graham Zielinski actually testified at a hearing in front of a court, and the court found that we could not meet those burdens and that Zielinski's testimony was credible, and there was a 2-page memorandum that set forth why we could not proceed on that third offense charge. And then because of the way the Wisconsin law is written, when you don't have that middle conviction, you have to have 2 convictions within a 10-year period to go back lifetime.
I see.
And so when that middle conviction fell off, there was something like 20 or 25 years between the first and then this other conviction. And so legally, it became a first offense.
Should that 10-year period, if you don't get another one within 10 years, it drops off, should that be changed?
I think it's something that I'd be open to discussion. I'm obviously not a legislator, but I think when people see that case and they're upset about that case, they call it a loophole. And so to the extent that there is that perception, I think it's something that the legislature certainly would be within their discretion to start talking about. Mindful, of course, that the first conviction for Zielinski I think was in like 1991, and then the third one was 25 plus years later. But I think when we talk about changes to the OWI laws, we need to be looking at common sense approaches that make sense and aren't just sort of knee-jerk reactions to a particular case. And Zielinski was unfortunate. Nobody wants a third time drunk driver to end up with a first offense, but the statute required it and the Constitution mandated that outcome regardless of who the defendant was and regardless of who the prosecutor was.
Your own campaign questioned a decision made by DA Schimmel. I don't want to get into the merits of that case, but let me ask you this question. Do you think voters care about these specific past decisions made by district attorneys such as you and Mr. Schimmel?
I don't think they do. I think the voters want to know that their next Attorney General is qualified. Attorney Schimmel and I have both spent over 15 years practicing law. We've both been frontline prosecutors. We've handled thousands of criminal cases, from homicides to sexual assaults and child pornography. So it's not going to be a question of qualifications. It's going to be a question, again, of the issues, of the ability to start working on bringing our citizens back together again to keep the politics out of the office. And I hope that the discussions that we're going to see over the next 61 days are going to be about the issues, are going to be about bringing our citizens back together again. Because look, the campaigns can sit and try to take a single case in isolation and pull it apart, or the media have done it, and I'm disappointed in the media coverage on both campaigns on these issues, because you can go back and forth throughout the rest of this campaign, and I don't think that's what the voters care about. It's not what I want this campaign to be about from my end. I think we need to focus on the issues, and I think we need to focus on the people of Wisconsin.
Two more questions on issues because we're almost out of time. First one, would you restore the public intervener to potentially look at issues like the open pit iron mine in Ashland and Iron County and frac sand mining, which is exploding in western Wisconsin?
I think the idea of a public intervener certainly has appeal, which is average citizens being able to have access to the government and being able to have violations addressed. Having said that, the Department of Justice has an environmental protection unit. We have great environmental laws on the books. We just need to enforce them. And something that I want to, once I'm elected, do is start right with the DNR. Talk about the types of violations they're seeing. Talk about the referrals that are being made. Talk about the referrals that aren't being made to either the Department of Justice or the citations and cases that aren't being referred to the district attorney's offices. Because, you know, the DNR has a lot of control about, with regard to whether they cite, what they cite for, and whether district attorneys receive referrals and whether DOJ actually receives referrals. So there's no question, as we've traveled around the state, that environmental protection is a concern for the vast majority of voters. We all want clean air. We all want clean water. I grew up hunting and fishing and ice fishing and snowmobiling with my dad. I want, you know, my daughter to be able to enjoy our natural resources, and I want, you know, for generations to come. And I, again, don't think that's a partisan issue. I think it's something that hunters agree on, and it's something that environmentalists agree on. And so I think there's just a great opportunity to make that a priority, you know, once I'm elected.
And there's a bill, I think it'll be reintroduced, that's saying that basically the wrong decision was made about 20 years ago when 17-year-olds charged with crimes are charged in adult court. And this bill would say, give juvenile courts again jurisdiction over them. Your position on that?
Right, so there is an interesting, you know, conflict between how we treat 17-year-olds. When they're victims, if you have a 17-year-old who, you know, maybe gets punched or hurt by a 19-year-old sibling, that 17-year-old is considered a child, and that could be felony child abuse. Then you can have a 17-year-old offender who possesses, you know, a pot or is extremely disruptive at school or otherwise disorderly, and now they're brought into the criminal justice system. And so I think that's something that certainly, you know, could be looked at, because it doesn't seem to account for the disparate treatment currently, and the fact that we know that our young people, when they're young like that, they do make you know, sort of instinctive, rash decisions. Their brains are still forming, and so, you know, we don't want to be unnecessarily bringing our young people into the criminal justice system. And so there's no perfect cutoff, but I think, you know, the conflict that we see in treating 17-year-olds as victims and then charging 17-year-olds automatically as criminals is a problem. Okay,
and then finally, closing argument, differences between you and D.A. Schimmel, why you should be elected on November 4 as Attorney General?
Well, you know, my background certainly is different. You know, coming from the Republican county as a Democrat, certainly coming through this primary, I was not my party's hand-picked candidate. We had a well-fought three-way primary among three great progressives, and so, you know, I'm tried and tested. I've been throughout the state. We've got great statewide recognition, and I think really, again, talking about the issues. I want to protect our rights and our values. I want to protect the right to vote. D.A. Schimmel has said that he would defend our voter ID. I want to protect the right for people to marry who they love. D.A. Schimmel has said that he would defend our same-sex marriage ban. And so it really is about being, you know, the candidate who wants to protect our values and our rights and not take them away, and truly be an advocate for all of our citizens, and not be, you know, subject to pressure and influence, you know, to toe the party line. That's not something I've done as district attorney. I've worked across the aisle with Republicans, you know, in my county, and we need more of that in our elected officials, and the voters are ready.
We're going to see that Harley ad again in the next 61 days?
I sure hope so. I don't know. It's the most riding I got was filming that part of the Harley ad, and that was actually on a nice country road just out, you know, at the end of my street. We sure enjoyed making that.
Thank you. Susan Happ, Jefferson County District Attorney, Democratic candidate for Attorney General. The election is November 4. Thanks for visiting with Wisconsin Eye.
Absolutely, anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.